Welcome back to another episode of My BrainWise Coach. I am Bastian.
And I'm Phil Dixon.
And we are extremely excited that you have joined us for another conversation this week related to all things neuroscience, a little bit of behavioral science, and how we can take all of that and apply it to our life. And Phil, we've been on this series over the last number of weeks. Actually, let me pause for a second. I got some feedback, as I'm going to just say, thank you, Mom. You came into my head just now. She's a faithful listener, Phil. And something that we forget to do quite often is to self-promote ourselves. If you've been enjoying our podcast and our series and conversation thus far, if you would please give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple, Audible, wherever it is you give your podcast. Comment on our videos, like them, share them with anyone in your family, your private circle, or your organization. We would really appreciate it because all of those things help others find us, and we're trying to continue to grow this BrainWise community. Just wanted to throw that plug in there, Phil, and I'm going to try to remember to do that each time. But we're so grateful that our BrainWise community is tuning in to us again today. And thus far, we've been really going into a conversation around unstucking our life, or a life transition, really, has been the general consensus over the last probably 8 weeks of conversation. We took a couple of breaks to talk about the neuroscience of resolutions or delivering hard feedback last week. But this week, we're going to wrap up our conversation on unstucking our life or life transition. And before we go into some of the new details, I'd like us to quickly recap what we've talked about thus far, because someone may not have been listening to the other episodes and they may want to go back because something prompts them to. So there's the transition map. I've been talking about different parts of the transition map over the last number of weeks. So Phil, take us through, maybe in 4 minutes or less, or whatever the time frame is. I don't want to put a time constraint, even though I just did, on what are the different parts of the transition map. And then I'll jump in and share anything that might be of notable mention before we dive into the final 2 pieces today.
So what we've really got is a fairly common map about where are you today, where do you want to be, and how are you going to get there. That's the fundamental part of it. Where do you want to go? That's the future. Where are you today? That's the present. And then how are you going to get there is the pathway in between. So those are 3 of the big constructs of the transition map. There's a couple of other things, though, that are important. One is our past life. Whether you're 18, 30, 40, or 75, your past life has built up a whole series of experiences, a whole worldview, all sorts of other things, which cast a shadow, not only on today, but it casts a shadow on the future and how you're actually going to go, what you found successful and what you found not successful in how do you make a change or move forward. So that's the 4th part of it. The future, today, the pathway forward, and the past. Those are the fundamental parts, and those are the big things that we've been talking about. As you move forward and you talk about your pathway forward, there's a couple of other things that go along in parallel to that. And one of them is, to what degree do you have the willpower, the resolve, the discipline to actually go ahead with what your plan is? And so that we call it resolve. And then the other part that goes along in parallel is, what help do you need from the outside world? And that is, it can be going out and getting education. It can be having a coach. It can be going to therapy. It can be learning something new, getting a degree, whatever it might be. Those are external factors that are going to help you on the pathway. So That's the big picture.
Yeah, and we've had I would say we've done probably about 8 weeks worth of conversation around this. And I think it's critical timing because we're going into the new year. A lot of times people are putting in New Year's resolutions and new goals and things, or they're trying to make some life choices or life decisions that are different or in a change of where they are in their current environment. And as we wrap up today, I think we're going to talk about the final 2 parts, which is all around having the resolve or the determination or the willpower to accomplish the plan to get from your current state environment today to your desired future state. And then obviously the external support. What are some of those external resources that you may need in order to do? And then I think we'll wrap up our conversation, Phil, with just what are some key or critical elements of the last 8 weeks of conversation that we've had for those who are making this critical life change. So that way we're leaving people with some really strong nuggets and kind of an overall summary so that if they want to, people can go back and listen to some of the past conversations. But why don't we start with the resolve or the determination or the willpower? What does that mean? And what are some of the exercises or things that we can do to help us either build it or determine if we've got it?
So we're going to talk about a number of things in big round buckets. How can you increase your, what I call your staying power? How can you understand how, in general, people adapt? And then what I call the change reflex, which is what happens very typically. But also one of the things we're going to look about is we've talked about the non-conscious brain and the conscious brain. Non-consciously, your brain has already made some decisions. So digging into what you've already made your decisions on can save you a lot of time. So part of what we're going to be talking about there is those four things. In terms of support, one of the things is we all talk about networking. And most people, when they go, oh, I don't want to do networking, it feels clammy. There's actually some formal ways we can go about doing networking. One of them is, how clear are you in explaining where you are today and where you want to be? And nailing that down at some level of clarity is useful. And identifying who are some of the role models or mentors that you might want to get. Then we're going to wrap it up by talking about how do you symbolize and ritualize and celebrate some of these things that you want to do. So that's what today's looks like. I'm ready to jump in if you are.
Yeah, let's start with, I think, probably the most fascinating, not that they're not all important, but let's start with the resolve or the determination conversation, because I have a feeling, my hypothesis is this is where probably a lot of times we are not successful, perhaps, in moving from our current state to our desired future state, because we either lack the resolve or we stumble along the way. There's a roadblock or a hurdle or a speed bump that ultimately impedes us from being able to move forward, whether it's ourselves possibly or other things that are happening.
Yeah, so let's jump straight onto that, whether you call them roadblocks or problems or challenges or whatever it might be. There was a big study done, and I think it started in about 1947. It's probably running out of steam now because it was going to be a longitudinal study for a group of about 900, primarily young men that were graduating. And my guess is most of them have actually gone on to a different place on the planet by now. But the study, after 25 years, wrote some learnings, and they assumed that there might be some fundamental attributes that we all had which would predetermine success in life. And they actually determined that they couldn't determine one. They couldn't determine anything. The only thing they could find as a commonality of people who were success was the following. And that is, they recognized a problem or a challenge or whatever it was. They came up with a plan to address it. They addressed it and then moved on, left it behind. And that was the only factors that they could find that was common between the people that were, quote, less successful and those that were more successful. And I think the learning from that is we're all going to face problems. It doesn't matter which pathway you choose. You're going to find something that's a speed bump or either a self-inflicted wound or something from somebody else. All right? It's going to happen. That doesn't mean your pathway was incorrect. It doesn't mean the progress you're making is slow or quick or you've made a wrong turn. It just means you're experiencing life in the same way that everybody else does. Recognize the problem, develop a plan to deal with it, and then let it behind. Don't ruminate. You've made your choice. And one of the things that there's a whole school of thought about making decisions is that our brains make the best decisions we can with the information available to us at a given point in time.
And I think I want to tag on to that point, Phil. I think when we are faced with a challenge or a problem or a speed bump, there's obviously a variety of things we can do. I think a lot of times I have witnessed in folks is, or not always, but a fair amount is there's this speed bump or a challenge that's in front of them, and they take it as a sign or an experience that they need to directionally change where they're headed. And maybe in some cases it is necessary. I can't speak for where they are in life. But oftentimes it's simply not that. It's a test of willpower or a test of your ability to problem solve or whatever the case might be, or it's just simply life is happening. We call it in my church, life is lifing. And it happens all the time. When we look at these problems, is really having the willpower, the determination to say, okay, this challenge is in front of me and I have a few choices. I can either turn around and not go for it. I can stay where I'm at. I can divert my path, or I can say, what are some of the external resources or some of the internal resources or whatever it might be that I need in order to get over the hump and still move in the direction that I was originally intending. Or I think another one is maybe my destination isn't changing entirely. It's just, it might look mildly different, but I'm still going to the same place. And so I think we don't have to just immediately turn around, but of course it's going to be part of, I'm assuming, our threat profile and certain things that come up that ultimately may or may not lead to me moving forward.
Yeah. And sometimes we start off by saying, I'm going to do this. And then in the process of starting off doing that, we're in an experimental stage, we realize maybe we just bit off a little bit more than we can chew. All right, now cut it back down a little bit. And It's not changing direction. I think that's number one. Number two is I learned something many years ago, and that is if you draw an arrow, we tend to think if we're off center of that arrow, there's something gone wrong. But we very rarely go from here to here that way. We tend to do this.
Zigzag.
So really what we need to do is, if you're setting up the arrow and the direction or wherever it is, then set a series of guidelines on either side, which is a mental way of saying anything I have happen, which is I'm bouncing between those guidelines, I'm still heading generally in the right direction.
Right. Which I think is, when you think about, which we haven't shown our visual, maybe I'll put it in the show notes for people to look at the transition map, the BrainWise transition map, but the pathway arrow is not a line. It's not we took a pencil and drew it across. It's a very chunky arrow, right? One of those blocky arrows, maybe is a better way to say it, because it gives you the room within it to be able to bounce a little bit.
Yeah.
And also on the very beginning, it's a stair step, is what it looks like to me anyways, but that's to allow for or to imply experimentation.
Yep. And so the only time you might want to say, oh, wait a minute, what's going on, is if you find yourself moving backwards. And that's a time to go, wait a minute, are the headwinds just too strong for me around here? And maybe I need to either tack or change direction or reset.
Right.
Most people, once they have determined that's where they want to go, can actually figure out a way to get there.
Right.
Anyway, so the first one is adaptation to what's going on. We all get problems. You are going to have problems, bumps, speed bumps, whatever you call them. Just address them. The second thing I want to talk about is what I call decisions already made. And I know we've practiced some of this, but as I'm describing this, you might think about if there's anything where you can recognize this process.
Sure.
And so the process is, there comes a point in time when we realize we've got a decision to make. And that might be a choice we have to make. It might be a decision around which direction we go in. It might be a decision to take on a new challenge, whatever it might be. So there's a point in time where we realize we've got that decision to make. Right. Most people then spend a small amount of time gathering information, doing research, having AI help them, talking to a mentor, talking to their spouse and family and this, that, and the other, but gathering data. And for most of us, that actually doesn't take very long. We actually think it is, but your non-conscious brain is working hard. And at some level, your non-conscious brain makes a decision. I'm going to do this. I am going to go get a master's degree. I am going to change my job. I am going to decide that I'm going to lose weight. Whatever it might be, we make that choice non-consciously very rapidly. However, it's non-conscious. And we might then, typically what we do is we take a whole bunch of time where we are thinking about it, ruminating it, running it over in our minds, kidding ourselves that we're still gathering data. What we're actually doing is taking time to gather data to justify the decision we've already made. And we can go back into all the things that mental models and schemas we have in our brain and confirmation bias and all that. Now, that's the reason why this is happening. But then once we go, yeah, that's the decision we made, we start another process, which is who are the people that I've got to get on board and convince? And we start justifying it to others. We start preparing them. I might be doing this, or hey, it wouldn't surprise me if you. We start to lay the groundwork for others. And then finally, it comes a point where we feel comfortable that it's time to, quote, announce the decision, right? That can take a long period of time, going through that justification process to yourself, announcing it to others. And very often when we look back, what we find is that there's nothing occurred during there about changing our mind. It was all about justification. And so one of the things I've challenged people to say is, what have you already made your mind up on?
Mm-hmm.
Because maybe it's time to start moving more towards moving into action rather than justification.
Totally. And I know for myself personally, there have been several, especially when it comes to finances or big choices. Now, I think I'm going to preface this by saying I think balance is important, because you can't, for example, and I'm going to say for myself, I would not be comfortable making some of these choices that I have made in the past in a split second. I need a little bit of the time to justify it or think about it or whatever, but then I probably don't need as much time, right? So how can I truncate it a little bit, still get what's necessary to make me feel comfortable with the decision, but then not make it this long drawn out process? But for example, when I went to go buy my furniture a number of years ago, it probably took me, I had thought about the idea to buy furniture. It was about $5,000, maybe $6,000. So it wasn't a lot of money, but to me at the time it was. And I thought about it for probably 3 months when I was like, do I buy this? Do I not? What do I want to do? I had talked to my mom about it. And what's funny is I didn't have to justify it to anybody, because at the time I was single, living by myself. I could do whatever I wanted to, but I still needed it felt like I needed some external validation for the decision that I was making. Same thing happened when I went and bought a car, or when I decided to get my master's degree. I had been thinking about getting my master's degree for 6 months. I had talked about it and all these things. One day I woke up at 5 a.m., signed up, and 2 weeks later I was taking my master's. But it took me the time, and I probably could have started a couple months earlier had I not justified it entirely. So I can see where it's come up for me and the patterns in which I use that time, and when it takes a little bit longer. And I think for myself, it's like, how do I find balance in giving myself the time to think about it, talk about it, make sure that it's the right decision, justify to some degree, but maybe not allow it to linger on as long as it has in the past.
Yeah, and I'll give you a couple of examples. But one of the things is, and so to your point of balance, there's a difference between evaluating and justifying. And we talked a little bit about how do you evaluate best case, worst case, and that type of thing. That's perfectly legitimate. Hey, if I choose to do this, what's the best case outcome? What's the worst case outcome?
Right.
Yeah, legitimate, sensible thing to do. But constantly trying to find yet another reason, another piece of data. I'm going to go and spend money on a vacation. Now I'm going to look at all the reasons why I should have that vacation and justify it to myself. Probably better to start the planning of the vacation. And I'll give you 2 examples of this. One is when I first came up with this sort of observation, that's what people did. I was talking to a woman that worked for me, and she was talking about how did she make a decision. And she was describing an event in her professional life. And I described that whole process to her. Hey, if you draw this out into 4 stages, where are you in each of these stages? And she realized that she was in the justifying to other people. I said, great. I hope that helps you next week when you get here. So the following week she came in and she said that conversation really helped. I said, great. What are you going to do about it? And she said, oh, no, not for that. She said, I've been thinking about getting a divorce for about 6 months now. And I realized I've already made the decision. I was justifying it myself and getting ready to justify it to others.
Oh my.
And that was, two examples right there, one professional, one personal. And then,
which I want to preface really quickly, Phil, for our BrainWise friends, we're by no means suggesting that process should lead you to making the decision to get divorced.
That's exactly right. No, I'm using that.
This is an example from experience, but we're not making a justification or any kind of inclination as to what someone listening should do. Because I could see someone going, Phil said on the podcast.
You're absolutely right. Thanks for that adaptation. But there was another one when I was working and I had a very major decision to make. It was based on the future platform we were going to use for our new computer systems in a company I was working for. And I had explained to my boss my thinking about past decisions and what I've already made minds up on. And came in one day for my one-on-one with her, and I was explaining where I was. And she said, "You've got a theory about this, don't you, Phil?" And I went, "Yeah, I do." And she said, "So where are you?" And I went, "I've made my mind up." And she said, "Good. That'll save us about 3 months." And I realized what I was doing was going round and round and round, collecting more data to reinforce the decision I'd already made and getting ready to brace myself for all the questions that were going to come up from other people. Now, it didn't mean I didn't have to go through that, but now I was more clear on, yes, I've already made the decision.
Right.
But be careful that you're not convincing yourself that you're searching for more data in order to make a decision when you've already made it.
100%. And remembering that evaluation and justification are not synonymous, they're different. And so giving yourself time to evaluate the decision is critical. And sometimes people need a little bit of time to marinate, to let it sit. But as long as you're not falling into this, and I suppose if someone is, I mean, that it's their choice, but the guidance is, or the suggestion or takeaway here is, if you're falling into the justification category, how much time is it taking away from you actually being able to just implement it? And what would the result be if you actually just made the decision in that space? Which I think I want to just really, we've been talking about resolve and determination. That is a key driver there, I think, when someone's able to say, you know what, I'm not going to justify it anymore. I'm just going to do it.
Yeah.
Because that demonstrates resolve and determination.
Yeah. And so now let's talk, I'm going to shift it slightly. And that is, when we decide to make a decision, especially if it's a behavioral decision, and let's say the behavioral decision I'm making is I'm going to be more assertive. What tends to happen is, okay, I'm going to be more assertive. And because of the way our brains work, we decide to behave slightly differently. And we move along the spectrum from being a scale of 1 to 10, an assertive level of 3 to an assertive level of 4. Mm-hmm. What it can feel like inside is that you've gone up to 9. You've become a crazy person. That's what it feels like. Now, the rest of the world won't see that. They'll see a move from 3 to 4. But internally, it feels like something much bigger is happening. Right. That's okay. However, what tends to happen is that the rest of the world is used to seeing us at 3. They observe us at 4, and it causes them to go into a panic. This is not the person that I know. This is not the person that is showing up the same way as they showed up the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. And they want stasis. They want things to remain the same. And so those people in our system will start to push back on us. And it will come out as comments like, "Did you get out the wrong side of the bed today?" Or, "Look at Phil, he must have had a bad weekend." Or, "Gosh, what's got into you?" Or all sorts of commentary like that. Right? So first of all, expect that. It's going to happen. If you don't expect it and you take that on board, that pressure, that pushing back, that cynicism, sarcasm, whatever it might be, we can actually retreat and go, wait a minute, I'm doing my best. I decided to make the change. And if this isn't good enough, I'm just going to go and retreat and go back. And we tend to go back even further than where we were. So that,
which I think is such an interesting, as you're describing it, Phil, especially in marriage, you can see this happen a lot with married people. We always encourage people to continue to get to know your spouse or your partner, because we're all changing and all evolving and we don't just stay the same. So what are the things you're doing to get to know them? And I think something that came to me when we decide, I'm Cole, make a decision that I'm going to change something. If I don't communicate that to my spouse and say, hey, I want to make this change, that's where these things can come into play, right? Where Joey is going to go, wait a minute, you're being more assertive. You're coming off as an AS or whatever. You're coming off as someone who's rude, or you're not listening, or all the things that might come up. And mainly because I haven't communicated that this is what I would like to do and why I would like to change it. And I think the takeaway, at least for me in this, is those non-conscious choices you're making, whether it's in therapy or I guess that's counterintuitive, those decisions you're making, because it can't be non-conscious if you've made a decision already on it. But if you made a decision, I'm going to change this, or in therapy, you've made this decision and you're married, I think I have a responsibility to tell my spouse about it if I want them to react appropriately and be able to help me along that change. Because otherwise, I'm immediately already doing myself a disservice.
And that was going to be the second part of the conversation. And at work, if you're going to go in and you said, I'm going to make a change, I'm going to be more assertive, or I'm going to listen more, it doesn't matter what change you've decided to make. Communicate it to your staff, to your boss, to your peers, and ask them for help. I'm sorry, put that the other way around. Ask them for their help and to assist. Hey, I'm practicing this stuff. I'm going to get it wrong. Choose I think we heard a term yesterday, an accountability buddy, but choose a change partner. All right, where somebody you trust, somebody who's credible, that you can take to one side and go, how am I coming across? And they can turn around and say, hey, you're doing great. You're exploring, you're pushing a little bit, you're coming up with those ideas, or yes, you're listening. It's not that you're closing down and withdrawing. They can give you some sort of sense of feedback about how you're coming across, because we're not very good at understanding how we come across to others. Right. Absolutely. When you make that change, you decide the change, communicate it to your team.
100%. I think that's great advice, regardless of where we are or who it might be. There's this expectation that we go into a lot of times that they should just know, especially in marriages, they should just know that this is what's happening. But the reality is people are not mind readers. If my husband listens to this podcast, he'll probably get a chuckle out of this, but I say that oftentimes, like, I'm not a mind reader. Help me understand, what exactly are you requesting, or what are you wanting me to do? Because I can't read the mind of my spouse, even though I can probably intuitively know what he might be talking about. It's better if you can explicitly state it. And especially if he's made a change or a choice to change something, it makes a difference. And it also helps me. It gives me the opportunity to continue knowing him, which is an important part of romance. So anyways, I think it's great advice across all the spectrums, because we're being upfront and transparent about something versus holding on to something and hoping that others see it, or that they're going to notice in the way we want them to, not in the way that they actually do.
And so this is all part of, how do you make certain the change that you intended to make, whether it be big or small, actually gets to be effectuated, that it actually comes to pass. So that's what, and so there's other aspects about resolve, but those are some of the things that people can actually put into practice. Switch for a moment and talk about some support.
Let's do it.
And I'm not sure we've covered a formal way of networking. I think we may have alluded to it, but I don't know whether we have ever actually covered it. Can you remind me?
No, I don't think we have. And I think it'd be great for us to do it. And I'll turn it over to you to do that. I think I want to just get people, when we're talking about networking, we're talking about building our circle of friends or professional colleagues to help do there's some goal that we're trying to accomplish typically. And so networking allows us the opportunity to do that. So Phil, if you want to share your formal way of doing it, I think it's a great time to do it.
So when most people say, I'm going to a networking event, they don't actually have a plan as to what they're going to do. It's ad hoc, bumping into people, talking about the weather, and eventually, oh, by the way, what is it you do? Should we exchange business cards and this and the other? There's nothing formal. So what this is about is much more targeted. And it can be actually an event. It can be just in a general change process. Let's take somebody we were working with this week. They want to expand their opportunity to do coaching, right? And so the formal process is to ask somebody that's in their circle already for 15 minutes of time, right? I might ask Charlie up the road. I know him well, but Charlie, can I have 15 minutes of your time? Most people, if they know us well enough, are going to go, sure. What do you want to talk about? So we break that 15 minutes down into 3. And the first 5 minutes is coming up with a very crisp description of where you want to go, where you are today, and what your plans are. Right? And we'll come back to how to make that into a crisp statement in a moment. It's become known as an elevator speech. I hate the term, but it's a crisp way of describing what you want to do, where you are, and how you're going to get there. And it varies. 5 minutes. Then you say to that other person, if you were me, what else would you be doing? Right? Now, they are not constrained by the mental models that you have. And so they may be saying some of the things that you thought about and didn't. Don't worry about all that. Just take it in. Because they're going to come up with 1 or 2 ideas that you go, oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way. Or I never would have thought of that. Because they're doing what they would do based on their mental models, which aren't necessary. So you're going to come up with 1 or 2 or maybe half a dozen ideas that you may not have thought about.
And my guess is it oftentimes takes longer than 5 minutes, and that's okay. We're just giving the construct of 5 minutes there.
The longest I've ever had in doing this was an hour and a half at that point. Most people say, oh, yeah, I can give you 15 minutes. And then when you ask them to talk about themselves, they are happy to talk about themselves for a long period of time. That's okay. And a point of advice here is as you're listening, take some notes. Because that's the message a non-conscious message to somebody else that they've got something value added that they're bringing to the exchange, right? So just take notes down and do the good listening practices we've talked about. Then the third thing is, would you please give me 3 of the people that you know that I could go and talk to, and would you effect an introduction? So the first 5 minutes is about you and what you're going to do. The second 5 minutes is about what would they suggest you do. And then the third is what 3 other people would you recommend I talk to? All right. Now that can expand fairly rapidly. If you start off talking to 6 people and they each give you 3, then you've got 18 people. So it becomes large in numbers, and you might get selective about who you actually talk to. But it actually turns out the theory says it's that next step out where you're going to come across the breakthrough ideas or the job you're looking for or the opportunity to do a consulting job or coaching job or whatever it might be. So formal mechanism. You don't have to. And I actually had somebody about 2 months ago who was about to go to a group of VCs, and she had no idea how to leverage that. And so I gave her that, and she went away and she said, I got 3 big contacts as a result of applying that particular system.
That's awesome. And I think it gives people, especially for those of us like myself, I'm fairly extroverted in nature and I enjoy talking to people. However, I don't enjoy the cold contact conversation, which is I'm calling you up or sending you an email or whatever, because it's just, there's oftentimes don't have a formal way. We started last week talking about external support and the resilience or the resolve that it takes to be able to transition. And where we ended our dialogue before we needed to pause and resume at a later time was in the conversation of external support, where we were going through a formal networking process where you were describing that you reach out to 3 or 4 or 10 or however many of your contacts that you have a direct relationship with, and then ask them if they've got 3 people they would recommend that you to talk to after you've gone through 5 minutes of where you're headed, what you want to accomplish, and then 5 minutes of asking them specifically what it is that they think you should be doing related to what you just described. And then the final part of the dialogue is who are the 3 people that you might be able to talk to in relation to the conversation you just had that might further advance kind of your overall priorities. And so that's where we ended the discussion. And I know there were a couple of additional things you might want to say around formal networking or external support in total. And then I think we'll summarize the journey we've been on over the last several weeks around life transitions.
Yeah, so a couple of minor changes. When you're talking to your contact, it's not what they think you should do, but what they would do. Because what you're trying to do is not have them filter and try and work out, you're not trying to project on what you would do. When most people these days have heard of a thing called the elevator speech. I particularly don't like the phraseology of it because it's become so widespread in usage now. But it is a useful concept, and that is to be able to practice when someone says, what is it that you do and where are you headed, that you don't fumble that speech. You've got it nailed down. And it's a minute to 2 minutes, something like that. This is where I am. This is where I'm going. I'm very brief. So yeah, I encourage everybody, if they're in that process of change, to actually develop that. Well, we need to come up with something other than elevator speech.
Yeah.
You maybe BrainWise elevator speech at least differentiates it a little bit.
And I think some people struggle with being able to put together a succinct kind of pitch of who they are and where they're headed. And with AI being introduced into our everyday work life, or even just like overall professional experience, highly recommend, if you haven't already, load your resume in it. I'm sure everyone's having conversations with AI, and ask it to help you develop a succinct, powerful pitch that's maybe 2 minutes or less, or whatever the time frame is that you're looking for. Maybe you have a couple of versions of it, and then practice it so that you have it down. So it's not something you have to think through. Probably you still need to think it through, but you can have some assistance in the thinking process.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, don't try and get it so like an actor where you are perfect, because people expect you to stumble a little bit. So it's okay to hesitate and go, oh, yeah, and always 1 or 2 words. It looks more natural. The other thing I will add in is if you have these conversations with your first level of contact or even your second level of contact, send them a thank you note. It just adds something, especially these days, if you can get a snail mail address and just send them a small handwritten note, it actually impacts you on their brain.
Right. 100%.
I
mean, because those types of thank you notes very rarely go out these days, but they are really powerful when you do get one, because you know that it took extra effort for them to do that.
Yeah. And it might take you for a couple of bucks to buy a box of them or something like that, but just make it personal from you. And don't accidentally send last year's Christmas cards to them.
And it's also related to your personal brand. What is it you want to be known for? How do you want people to think about you, or what do you want them to say about you or experience when working with you? And by sending that, you're differentiating yourself, number 1, from others, but then 2, you're really showing up in a way that's very authentic compared to possibly others in their circle of influence.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of other thoughts, and hopefully it has helped our BrainWise friends to not be shocked when someone says, yes, go do some networking. You've actually got a tool to do it now. And you might even find that you actually enjoy it after a while. A couple of other general ideas I'll throw out there. You've mentioned it. You use AI in a couple of ways. You can load any of the thoughts you have about where you want to go and what your future looks like, and ask AI to critique you and offer some suggestions. I know that you've got a book that you recommend to people to use AI to its greatest extent.
And of course, there's no affiliation between myself or My BrainWise Coach in this particular book, but it's called, for those who can see, I'll show it on screen. I always have it pretty close. The AI-Driven Leader by Jeff Woods, I think is how you pronounce his name. And it was recommended to me, I don't know, maybe a year or so ago. And it's fantastic. It really begins to help everyone rethink how are they using AI to become a strategic thought partner, build more thought currency, and be able to really take things to a different perspective versus which it's still appropriate to use AI for writing an email or helping to come up with some kind of content or whatever, but it can be used in a more powerful way to help drive you forward.
Yeah. And you recommended it to me. I bought the book, and every so often, if I'm slightly stuck on how to structure a prompt, I'll open it up and it'll give me some advice. And go onto the net, look around, still use some Google searches. It still works. So use that. Start asking around your friends. What have they done? What did they try and change, and what worked and what didn't? And if they got any advice for you, if you can find someone else that is an adept in the fields that you're looking into, either the behavioral fields, somebody who's really good at asking questions and you want to learn how to ask questions, go to the source. If you want to move into the acting profession, you go and find some actors or some people in that field that you know about. And also investigate online classes. There's so many online classes. If they're free, they're probably borderline, but some of them are very cheap these days. You use the online classes. It's called asynchronous. You can go and learn at any point in time, which is convenient for you rather than when the class is being run. Books, those good old-fashioned sources of information. It's what we used to call software before we had computers. Books. Don't also forget your local library. Most of them are there, and most of them these days are well trained in how to help. So if you go in and say, I'd like to have the best book on how to learn fly fishing, they're going to help you out. Pick a colleague or a friend that will give you some feedback on how you're doing in your progress. Obviously, you want to trust them, and they've got to be credible. It's nothing quite like actually having somebody else say, hey, you might consider whatever it might be.
Right.
Find a coach. If it's an important change for you in your life, spending a little bit of money on getting some professional coaching help, I would always say interview 2 or 3 or 4 just to find someone who's simpatico and compatible with you. They're trained to help you on your journey. Start a journal. Right. Journals are wonderful. Peter Drucker basically recommended every manager and leader to write a journal on a regular basis. And part of that is what we've been doing, but also part of it is, he said, when you go back over 2 or 3 years and look back, what are the decisions you were facing? How did you make the decision? And with the benefit of hindsight, did it work? Did you make the right one? And what can you learn from that? So there's a lot of other bits and pieces that you can use as part of that external support journey.
And I think one too, Phil, that is depending on where one might be in their life journey and what they're trying to accomplish or what they're currently experiencing, therapy is highly recommended by myself. And I know you also would, depending on the situation, because it can help someone, especially if you're feeling there's things in your life that you need to work through, or you're having a hard time being able to see what the future might look like because of current or past circumstances. I think it's a powerful tool to help in the right setting because it can help us work through things that we may not have been able to do on our own.
And I think that's a really good point. And maybe it's worth spending just a couple of minutes on what's the difference between a coach and a therapist.
Yeah, let's do it.
Do you want to take first go, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'll describe it from my experience and then add in, Phil, what your thoughts are. When I think of coach, coaches are typically certified in some form of coaching practice, but they're not trying to resolve past issues. They're simply trying to help you see things from a different perspective, ask and facilitate a dialogue that ultimately will navigate you towards your end objective, right? And might remove some of the clutter because they're a third party coming in to help you see what the future might be and where you might currently be at. Whereas a therapist is going to they've been professionally trained, they've gone through a number of certification processes and educational background in order to have the license of therapist. And their job is to do, maybe there's some similarities there in terms of helping like what a coach might do, but more specifically recognizing patterns and past behavioral things and experiences that may have driven you to act or believe or show up in a certain way and resolve it, which is the biggest part or the biggest difference, I think, in a lot of ways between a therapist and a coach. And then, of course, they typically have different therapeutic exercises and different therapies that they'll help you work through certain experiences so that you can be able to move forward in whatever it is you're trying to accomplish.
What he said.
Yeah, it's a brief or maybe a not so brief, but difference between the two. And both are powerful in one journey, I think, depending on where you are, whether it's career or personally related, and specifically what you're trying to accomplish. I have many coaches in my life. You, Phil, are one of many things, and friend, mentor, coach to me, as well as someone we had on our podcast a few episodes ago, Cheryl Kish. But then I also see a therapist and I go and talk to her because there's things that it just helps from a different perspective to be able to work through things. Highly recommend all of it because it does help people be able to move through it. Now, I'm not saying that everyone needs to go to therapy because there are some people that live in that belief system. I don't think that is true. I think that you have to be able to recognize in yourself when it is necessary and then take the appropriate steps to do it. And you may go in and out of therapy based off what might be going on in your life because you might be having a more stressful time at a particular moment and then you work through that and you may not need to continue going. So it's never a bad thing, but it's also not something that I personally would say everyone has to have a therapist because we all have got these major issues. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's just if you recognize that there is an opportunity, then certainly we encourage people to do that.
Yeah. And I hate to put it this way, but the therapist, the coach, they are just another tool to help you in your journey. That's it. So talking of which, one of the other things to do is to identify some role models and mentors. If you can find some people that have either gone through a change that's similar to you and you go, wow, I can recognize that. I wonder how they did it. Or people who have an expertise in where you're heading and again, a mentor is not necessarily a coach. A mentor is going to basically give you some ideas and techniques more often than not about how they did it. And again, that might be the mentor turns around and says, and here's some recommendations about what you might do. A coach is designed to facilitate your thinking about your issues and questions and futures and things like that. Whereas the mentor might not be so subtle. They actually might turn around and say, hey, no, do this, do that, or try this, try that. Or think about this, think about that. So again, role models and mentors, a great source. And the role model, you can also be role models that are the opposite of what you want. And there's still learning to come from people who don't do it the way you want to do. Okay, what is it that they're doing? And I'm going to do something different. So there's pretty much everybody in our sphere, there's something we can learn from.
Absolutely. When you say that, there's a million things that go off in my brain where I'm like, okay, yes, I know there's people that I've said, okay, I'm not going to model my life transition or my life after that particular person, but I don't necessarily go seek their advice either. I seek the advice of a positive role model. I'm just observing these other individuals and saying, okay, that's a great example of what I will not do. And then ensure that as I go along my life journey, that's incorporated.
Yeah, and I can think of several people in my background in the past that I go, nope, that I can learn from them because I am going to make certain I don't make that mistake. And that's where the learning comes from.
So. Absolutely. And I think, Phil, we've shared a lot of information over the last, I don't even know how many episodes it's been now, maybe 5 or 6, or unstucking our life or life transitions or career transitions or changes. And so maybe we can summarize, I don't want to put a time constraint on it, but summarize for our listeners what we've talked about and then kind of where they can take it if that's their desire.
Absolutely. Do you want me to start that summary?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead and I'll jump in and add where I feel I might want to.
Let's revise, if you like. It's an old school verb that I remember many years ago. The first thing we started with is talking about your future. And we talked about ways of identifying that. And that becomes the driver for everything. What is it you're trying to get? And whether that's a future which is 6 months away, a year away, 4 years away. I'm 76 and I'm working on my future of what it might be when I'm 80.
Look, a day over 65, Phil.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm several days over 65. Wait a minute, let me count them. In all seriousness, it doesn't matter whether it's 6 months, a year. Nowadays, planning a 10-year, 15, 20-year, that's getting more and more difficult. Something between 3 and 5 is a good target. So
Yeah.
identify your future. Make it as rich as possible. Now, there's a lot of theorists out there say we actually don't know what we want in the future. I fully agree with that. Sometimes we change our mind, but actually having a picture of where you want to drive to, at least as far as it seems from where you are right now, actually does something to the brain, and it helps the brain go, oh, that's what we want to do. And the brain starts to put things in perspective in line with that driven future. So then, where are you today? What's going on with you? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What are your passions? What do you love doing? What do you hate doing? We talked about the love-loathe situation. Where are your strengths? What can you rely upon? What are the qualities you have that are always going to be with you? And so there's the strengths, the qualities, and the values. There's bedrock for what's going on. The research I did many years ago on people who've gone through a significant and effective change use those qualities, those strengths, as a part of the process to actually enable their change to occur. And you mentioned this earlier on. What's the impact of the past, especially the recent past? There is a thing called the recency bias, which is things that have happened to us just in the last month, 2 months, whatever it might be, that we ascribe a greater value to those and we pay more attention to them for good or bad. But what are all the things that have happened to you in the past? What are some of the things that you look back at and you go, oh, that was an incredibly successful period of time in my life, or an incredibly successful event? What made that successful? What was the context? What were the attributes that you brought? And so therefore, any of that totality of the context and what you brought is likely to also give you pleasure moving forward. So how can you create those events moving forward? What are the things you look back at and you go, oops, that didn't work quite so well? And what would you have done differently? And how can you evaluate that? And all of it is in service of learning something and then translating it into something you want in the future. Then we talked about what's the resolve that you're going to bring to bear. How do you make sure that you've got some resilience, you've got willpower, you've got some discipline in doing the things that you actually said you're going to do? Oh, well, I missed out. What's the pathway? What's the commitments that you're going to make to move forward? Some of them are going to be experimental commitments. Hey, I'm going to evaluate this. I'm going to see what this is all about, or whatever it might be, or I'm going to research this. Or for some people, it's no, I am going to go and do a degree, and whatever it might be. So then go back. What's the resolutions that you're going to put in place to actually say, yes, I am going to move ahead on this? When you fall off the wagon slightly, how are you going to recover? And then we just spent some time talking about what's the external help that you can get, both in terms of classes and all those other things, but particularly around people that can help and educational opportunities. I'm going to add one other thing, and that is we haven't talked much about celebrating successes.
We did do the neuroscience of celebrations on my birthday. So there is a bit about that. If you want to go back to the digest episode in November, I think somewhere around the 18th, but we did do a little bit of that. Not in this series, though.
But one of the things we know about change is to celebrate even the smallest of changes and the smallest of successes. So if you actually went through a week where you didn't go to the refrigerator and eat ice cream or chocolate, just to mention a couple at random, then celebrate it. And I'm not suggesting celebrate by going to the ice cream parlor and eating ice cream, but find a way of celebrating your own successes. It's a sort of self-reinforcing loop, and it's really important. And the other thing to do is come up with a symbol that represents where you are going, and put pictures of it around. Actually, if it's something which is material, go and buy one of them. So that everywhere you have, it's a symbol of where you are going. And it's a message, a visual message to your brain. This is where we're headed. And it's a reminder. Can you develop a ritual whereby you hand off something of your past, which represents the drag, the anchor at the back of the boat? What do you want to do to eliminate that tendency to go backwards? And so all of those things can help symbols, celebrations of you moving forward.
I think it's excellent. And we've had the last 6 episodes or so have been a great series, I think, for people. And we'll reference it a lot, I'm sure, as we move forward. As people are going through life transitions, there's been a tremendous amount of activities and exercises and takeaways that everyone, I think, can find something as we're all experiencing change. Or maybe we're not feeling stuck, but there could be things that we want to do differently. And you can follow the same process. I think our BrainWise advice or recommendation is where you are in life and where you might want to go. What are some of the things that we've talked about in the last 6 episodes around unstucking our life that can help you be able to maybe identify an area where you want to see growth, where you want to see change, or you want to celebrate something more, or whatever it might be? What are some of those exercises that you can do to begin to help navigate yourself to your desired future state? And yeah, go ahead.
I've got a couple of phrases or sayings that have come from a variety of sources, which sort of, for me, summarize this life's journey. Okay, if I just offer them
Yeah.
to our BrainWise listeners. And these are 3 things that attracted me many years ago. The first one is from a guy called Charles Louis de Seconda. I have no idea who he is, but he said something.
Me neither.
Somebody on our listening group may know. We received 3 educations, one from our parents, one from our school teachers, and one from the world. The third one contradicts pretty much everything that the first 2 taught us. I.e., you've got a background, you were taught lots of things, but in the real world, some of those things don't actually apply. And our job is to learn how to adapt to those things that are the reality rather than the theory of what we were taught. The second one is this, and is life is like playing a violin solo in public and learning the instrument as one goes along. We're all learning that violin in some way, shape, or form, and we're doing so in public. So you're not going to get it right all the time, but it's a learning journey for us. And then the last one is how people tend to back off when they're trying to change or they're trying to evolve or do something different. And it was Eleanor Roosevelt said, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent."
I use that one a lot. And you can replace the word inferior with a variety of things. No one can make you feel anger. No one can make you feel sad. Basically, the message is no one can make you feel anything unless you consent to letting it happen.
Yeah. So anyway, if anybody has experience of going through a change that they want to tell us about, that we can use as examples, we'd love to hear from you. If anybody is attempting a change and running into something that they didn't anticipate, again, love to hear from you. Because
Absolutely.
the more examples we can get of people taking these ideas and putting them into practice, that's the whole part of what we're trying to do is how do you take these ideas and put them directly into practice?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, leave it in the comment section, whether it's on YouTube, TikTok, wherever it is. Gather our information or listen to us, or send us an email at questions@mybrainwisecoach.com, because we'd love to have a conversation and a dialogue if it's of interest and you might need some help or just want to share some experiences. And with that, Phil, I think it's a great way to say goodbye, not for now, I guess, is truthfully, but not forever, because we'll be back next week with another episode. And of course, if our BrainWise friends enjoyed our podcast discussion today, we highly encourage you or ask that you rate us and give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcasts, wherever it is you get your podcasts. Subscribe, comment, like, share our information with your friends and family. and your colleagues so that they too can begin to live in a brain-wise way, because it does help others find our podcast as they go along their life's journey. And with that, as always, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay
Be
brain-wise.
brainwise.